All right, so the recording has started, and thank you guys for being here. This is awesome, and Rhia for saying yes to the invitation.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, I do want to hand it over to you pretty quickly here, but I'll just say that, and I said it a few times already, that Kim is a member of, she's a graduate of our teacher training and a teacher, started a new class yesterday, and asked a question inside of one of the things that we offer through our company called Mind Tribes. It's called My Tribe, and it's for us, it's a forum for, right now we're starting with mostly our graduates. We have graduates in a few different cities, and it's a way, we've always had this commitment to go, how do we keep people connected and start like crossing the, I don't know, crossing the line such that people can grow and learn from one another and stay committed to the work. So that's, it's something we started I would say about less than a month ago, and we already have a bunch of people that are jumping on. And part of that work is to really have it be a channel for us to ask what our graduates are interested in, and then hopefully share resources with them. And Kim, said, I want to learn about Yin Yoga, and we knew right away that we wanted to reach out to you, Rhia. So that's all I'll say about that. But the floor is really yours. We have basically an hour, and anything you want to share. And I know you have a training coming up, so I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear about that too.
Well, yeah. And first of all, just to say thank you for thinking of me and putting together this platform. This is great.
Yeah, of course. You're welcome.
Well, one of the things that we talked about in our initial conversation was, a brief history of Yin Yoga. And then I also thought to cover maybe the first primary principles or Tattvas of the practice. So I'll just jump right in. If you guys have questions, absolutely, just holler. The first name you'll see kind of surrounding the history of Yin is a guy by the name of Polly Zink, and he's got kind of an interesting backstory. He's got a website. If you're like one of those people that goes, oh, I want to know all the details, but well, let me back up a little bit. So Yin Yoga is really associated with Taoism, and Taoism, like yoga, is a huge spiritual practice that encompasses several different modalities. We might just think of the Tao and that book representing Taoism, but Taoism also has physical practices. It has an understanding of the subtle body and the energetics of the subtle body. It's very wide ranging in its modalities, and so Polly Zink studied Taoism, and he was studying, or he was actually practicing and teaching this specific kind of kung fu called monkey kung fu. And that in itself is an interesting story. So monkey kung fu comes from this man who was imprisoned in China for a murder, I believe. And he was in solitary confinement for decade or something. And anyways, out of his window, he could see monkeys. And so for this 8-9 years, he studied the movements of monkeys. And when he got out of prison, he developed this kind of movement called monkey kung fu, which eventually made its way to Hong Kong and to a man who would immigrate to America in the late 70s. Now, Polly Zink studies with this man, is teaching this monkey kung fu, and it contains some of the elements that we see in, I'll say, modern yin, yin as we know it today, I guess. But it is also enveloped in several other forms of movement that we would more associate it with, like martial arts. And so Polly Zink eventually gets on public television programming. It has a show. Fast forward 10 years, and the big name that comes out of this history is Paul Grilly. And Paul Grilly is whatever. He's a yogi. He's been practicing teaching for 10 years at this point. He's primarily an Ashtanga yogi. And if you've ever seen a picture of Paul, he's on the shorter side and just very muscular. He sees this PBS programming basically of Polly Zink moving in this way, and he's intrigued. And he basically tracks down Polly Zink and is like, teach me what you know. So Paul really studies under Paul. Paul really studies under Polly. And during this time, he's also very fluid. So he's studying anatomy, and he is still continuing his kind of Ashtanga practices, et cetera, but he starts incorporating what we know as this kind of longer sits in these poses. He definitely sees the benefit of them. So Paul begins teaching what he initially calls Taoist yoga, which is a thing. Four Dragons, I believe, has Taoist yoga or Taoist Yin. But eventually he kind of separates it out from this Taoist piece because he's really focusing on the movements. And I say movements slightly because if you've taken Yin class, it's not a lot of movement, but these postures, longer held postures. And he begins calling that Yin Yoga. Sarah Powers, which is the other big primary name in this tradition, takes some classes from Paul. She's also an Ashtanga yogi, power flow kind of teacher, very powerful practice. She studies with Paul, and then they're good friends, but they take different approaches to the practice. So Paul really, I've studied with both of them. Paul really becomes anatomy oriented. It's funny because when you think of the big anatomy names in yoga, like Leslie Kaminoff comes to mind. Paul really does not. But if you go to his website and look at what his offerings are about, they're really they're anatomy focused. And what he brings to the table, I mean, he studies under Gil Hedley, and when you do a workshop with him, he generally travels with like real human bones, and his whole kind of focus and point of the practice is that, look at, here's two femur heads, two different people's femur heads, here's a pelvis, and they're going to fit in here completely differently based on how this femur head is shaped in terms of rotation, in terms of depth. So how could you possibly know when somebody comes into a posture, what is causing their tightness? Is it compression? Is it bone-on-bone compression? Or is it muscular tension or tightness or resistance? And he's showing you, like, one of the first things, an aha moment for me in studying with him was like, oh, well, there's certain anatomy cues that are just, you could never be that precise and specific in terms of telling people, turn your foot out 16 degrees, because that wouldn't work for somebody whose, femur head was sitting in their pelvis in the way he's showing you. So that's Paul's focus in terms of how he approaches teaching Yin. And then on the other side is Sarah Powers, who is actually who I began studying the tradition with. Sarah studies Yin. She also gets very heavily involved in Vipassana meditation, Buddhist psychology. And so for Sarah, the modality of Yin was this kind of amazing place to be able to give a Dharma talk. So when you take a class with a workshop or class with Paul, he's very funny, very informative. He's giving you lots of information about the anatomy that's involved and about how you might be feeling. And Sarah's using it as a platform to really talk about whatever, her lecture might be about. So some kind of piece about Buddhist psychology, who knows? I didn't study Buddhist psychology, so sometimes her lectures would be lost on me, but they would make those poses go by very fast because it was fascinating. So enter, that all happens. The first time I was telling Guillermino, I studied with Sarah in maybe 1999, 98, 99. I just happened, she came to the studio that I was practicing at, heavily involved in a studio in Seattle called 8 Limbs. And she was teaching a 3-day Friday, Saturday, Sunday workshop. I was like, oh, that, sounds interesting. And I was blown away. I had been practicing yoga for a while, several years at that point, and instinctively knew that I should be meditating, that there was, I was getting fed more than an asana practice at this time, and yet I still was not able to meditate. Typical like 20-year-old, I was just like, I can't sit for 5 minutes. And so what the practice of yin in that particular workshop with Sarah showed me is a doorway, a gateway, a path to being able to sit, because I got to do something. She literally said, consider each of these poses their own meditation seat. And, I just tasted moments of stillness for the first time. And so that's how I really became hooked. And so my own teacher, a woman named Melina Meza, studied heavily with Sarah. I studied with Sarah and Paul several times after that, and just kind of adopted yin as a really heavy part of my own practice. So of course, as a teacher, I love to share it. So that is the history of yin. Now, today, it's interesting because yin has kind of taken on its own meaning. Paul was really kind of specific in the beginning. He was like, I'm not going to copyright this style. Hey, if you want to teach it, teach it. If great. He wasn't interested in like owning the style, which on some level is really honorable. And on another level, like given where yoga is today and how abused the term yin is unfortunate, because what yin has kind of come to mean is just like anything that's not yang, which is a huge bucket. So as our yoga practice shows elements of our cultural pathology, and we have certainly gravitated towards a powerful, yang style practice. We've also kind of overly emphasized flexibility. So the pendulum, it's good to see the pendulum swing back. Like right now, you hear a lot about yin, you hear a lot about restorative, you hear a lot about yoga nidra, and it's great. And there's just a lot of people that go, oh, well, yin is long holds. So I see, it's like yin will hold anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. It's like, well, actually, there's some principles around yin that make yin yin. If you're using it as just a counterpoint to yang, I mean, I guess anything held for longer than 1 to 5 breaths would count. But I teach it more from the perspective that I learned from both Paul and Sarah. So it means something pretty specific. So I'll go into those 3 kind of primary principles, unless there's any questions about monkey kung fu, which I am certainly not an expert in, but makes a fascinating story. Good to go? All right. So 3 primary principles to yin. These are the things to me that make yin class a yin class. And the first one is this idea of kind of finding an appropriate depth. Interestingly enough, this is where a lot of misconceptions around yin come into play. Most of yin is not trying to increase flexibility or stretch things. It's actually about creating joint stability. So when you look at the body, the yin tissues are the bones, the ligaments, the joints, and the fascia. And I'll get to why. Again, fascia is about as buzzy of a buzzword, interesting, word as you can get right now in the yoga world. but it wasn't a primary focus, certainly for Sarah, if only in terms of that is where the belief is, that in terms of where the subtle body, the meridians are running along those fascial lines. Paul would mention fascia, but and Dan, you can attest this, the fascia research is like in babydom right now. It's not as established as your kind of general medical anatomy knowledge. It's a hot topic, and there's lots of stuff coming out, and it's very contradictory. That being said, there's obviously some established research out there, but it's pretty new. Mm-hmm. And so all that to say, in terms of coming into a depth in a posture, what is interesting is practicing at 70 to 80% of your capacity is really where it's at in yin. You're not going into your full capacity and like trying to hang out and like force yourself through that 5 minutes. Because frankly, when you get into longer holds, the work becomes far more psychological. So certainly so the work on depth is really about stressing the tissues rather than stretching. In order to do that, yin yoga is a dish best served cold. So you don't want to be warmed up in terms of like Vin Yin. That traditionally doesn't make a lot of sense. If you warm up the body, the tissues that are going to feel the most work are the muscles. They're kind of like, I like to say, a greedy tissue. Like they're like, yes, work us out. What yin is about is a passive stretch. So you want to try to bypass the muscles. You want to use as few muscles as possible so that you can, in fact, access ligaments, tendons, joints, bones, and the fascia. So depth is an interesting place. There's different terms, different places to work in terms of finding the appropriate depth. You're looking at not going into, again, your deepest possible forward fold and like cringing your way through the next few minutes. It's about finding, I think both Bernie Clark and Paul Grilly talk about the Goldilocks position quite a bit. It's like not so little sensation that there's no point, you're going to be bored, and not so much sensation that you have to like grit your teeth and you're counting the seconds and like, oh my God, how much longer are we going to stay here? That's inevitable, of course, in some postures. But that is not like the entire experience. It shouldn't be the entire experience of yin. So finding appropriate depth is kind of the number one thing. Or I should say the first tattva. Any questions about that before I go on? Okay. The second one is stillness. So, this to me is such a beautiful principle and practice. In addition to my background in yin, I've studied for the last 7 years with Rod Stryker, who is the founder of Para Yoga. And he also in his practices emphasizes stability over flexibility, which is what we would be looking for, by the way, in our joints. We would never, if you said, I teach yin and we are, stretching out the joints and the ligaments, anyone who knows anything about bones would be like, that sounds awful. Why would you do that? That's your last protection in terms of keeping, your body stable. So it isn't about stretching the joints. It's about stressing them. In other words, applying a load, right, a particular load on your joints, and then releasing, resting. And, exercise theory basically says you stress a joint or you stress a tissue, you rest, the tissue comes back stronger. So so anyways, I say that to include, like, under my studies with Rod, it's been so interesting because he is not a yin teacher at all. Para yoga is much more under the hatha umbrella, but he is not flow. And he does have you hold certain poses for, 30 seconds to a minute and a half. And he's like, take out any unnecessary movement. We have all been brought up now in this kind of yoga culture of like micro adjustments. We have this, like, you come in and you're like, there's like no stillness, even when you're trying to be still. And, again, to quote Rod, he's like, you got to learn how to still the body before you can still the mind. It's just step one. And you see how hard it is to be still for 30 seconds in a posture. You're literally like, your skin is like, but if I just moved my finger, maybe it would make this next 2 breaths a little bit more bearable. I wouldn't be present, right? Or I can just, in the forward fold, you see it all the time. People are like, oh, look at that toenail. Huh. It needs my attention right now. No, it doesn't. Just leave it alone. So this idea of stillness is critical. And it's really where Paul makes a case for yin yoga being probably closer to traditional, like we're talking centuries old yoga, than what we see in this kind of modern, excessive movement-based yoga. He's like, look, you go back, certainly in the sutras, asana is mentioned 3 times. And it is mentioned in the context of stability and ease as being these kind of 2 pillars of what defines asana. You can look at the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. There certainly is more poses, but there's not a lot of like information about how to practice, or certainly sequencing, not in the ancient texts. So, and so there's a little bit of reading into it on Paul's in Paul's place, but in his defense, I suspect he's right. A lot of times you hear teachers talk about, well, look, asana is really a prep to be able to sit. What do we need to be able to sit? Well, we need a strong lower back. We need open hips, open hamstrings. It's good to have open shoulders, but it's not really critical for being able to just sit in Sukhasana. So stillness, huge piece, and a great invitation, a great piece of this practice is like, it's built in. So you give people an opportunity to kind of shift and move and find, like I said, that depth. And you encourage them, hey, I want you to try to stick through this for the next few minutes. And you acknowledge, like, you're going to run through the whole, all of the emotions. This is great. This sucks. I'm bored. I'm not bored. When is this over? Wait, I'm totally into this. It's just like meditation, really. And yet you're trying to find that through line, that baseline, that part of you that is unchanging, the part of you that is not affected by the sensations, both mental and physical. So it's a really, to me, like I said, just going back to when I first fell in love with the practice, which was really the first time I practiced it, it was such a gateway to being able to understand how to sit and what that was about, and just getting a taste of that really sweet stillness. Any questions? Let's throw that out there. No? Okay. So the other piece, the other third tattva, the third kind of primary principle that makes yin yin is a long hold, holding the poses for a significant amount of time. In general, that is on the lower end, probably 2 minutes. And advanced yin exists. It does not have specialized poses. What it has is longer holds. So how long are you able to stay in this hold? You might see people ask you to stay in something for 20 minutes. I don't practice, nor do I teach a lot of advanced yin. I find beginner yin actually still serves me quite well. So again, going back to what are the yin tissues? What are the tissues in the body we're trying to affect? The bones, the joints, the ligaments, the tendons, the fascia. This is done through passive holding. When you, and by the way, I should mention also yin yoga is the lower half of the body. So you're not going to see shoulder work in yin. You're not going to see neck in yin. There's really just not that much tissue really there that you would want to work with. So it's all hips, hamstrings, lower back, and pelvis, period. Like if I went to a class and my kids are going back to school in a few weeks, like I have the intention of dropping into some classes, and I'm so excited to be a student, but also I would be highly concerned if someone threw out like a 3-minute hold in a shoulder opener. I'd be like, no, I think I'll modify, thanks. So you can kind of think about the principle of orthodontic work, right? If you're trying to affect bone, if you're really trying to move teeth and jaws, you don't like take your tooth and go pull it out, push it in, pull it out. What would happen if you did that over time is the tooth would fall out, which is like such a common nightmare. Well, at least I have that occasionally. But what you do is you apply a little bit of pressure over a long period of time, and that is how you would affect teeth. In other words, that is how you affect these kind of like, they're not as juicy of a material as, say, the muscle or the skin. They're drier. They have these kind of yin qualities. And so in order to affect them, the long hold is required. So that's on the physical level. Again, yin yoga has ties to Taoism. It has ties to traditional Chinese medicine. So if you all have ever been to an acupuncture session, you know that in order to affect the meridians, the meridian lines, and how yogis call it prana, but in TCM it's called chi, in order to affect energy flow, they're not sticking a needle in, taking it out. They stick it in different, places, and then they set their timer for 20, 25 minutes, walk away, and let you kind of let that work soak in. So it's really the same with yin. On an energetic level, you've got to have the longer holds in order to affect the chi, or as yogis call prana, life force is the English term for that. So those are really the 3 principles that make yin yin. Long holds, finding an appropriate depth. That's a depth that you can kind of live in for a little while. And then the stillness, which is critical. So those 3 principles obviously will affect how you practice yin, certainly affects how you teach yin. It's one of the things that I find so interesting. There really aren't adjustments in yin. That goes for a couple reasons. One, again, there's the understanding that we don't really know without X-ray vision what is causing someone's tightness. Is it tension? Is it tensile? So is it muscular, or is there a bone in the way? A bone on bone compression. Yin, by the way, is not, when I see someone who's super flexible come into yin, it's not the right practice for them. And I usually kind of at some point pull them aside, and they're like, but I love, I love it. It's my meditation. I'm like, go to restorative where you will be supported, because for a hypermobile, hyperflexible person, it's just they need massive stability. They need to be building the muscle. The yang practices are actually far more effective for them. So and again, we cover all of this in the training. So this is probably a good segue. The training is a 20-hour, 2-weekend training. And still, we really just cover and scratch the surface of yin. So we cover what yin is, how to practice it, how to structure classes, what's different than a hatha class, how you're going to teach differently, which again, I just hinted to, there's not a lot of, there is no hands-on adjustments traditionally. That doesn't mean you won't touch students. I'm talking to students a lot when I'm going around the classes, like, what do you, especially if I see someone who's like, looks like they're struggling, or I'm not sure if they're feeling the posture and where you want to feel it. It's like, kind of get down. It's like, where are you feeling this? Okay, well, let's try this. And how can we make this, a little bit more reasonable for the next few minutes? So how to teach yin, we do cover kind of an overview of TCM and meridian theory and how this practice is affecting that, and how to bring this practice to beginners, to new people. We do get into a little bit of the anatomy, the fascia, and that is a recent addition to the training, just because there is so much interest in that. I myself, I'm not an expert in fascia by any means. And in fact, I'm partnering with Christina Keller next year to do Yin Yoga Part 2 for the teacher trainees that will focus on the gross anatomy of fascia and the subtle body of fascia. But it's extra information. You can certainly teach Yin Yoga without having all of the understanding of, the sarcomeres and these kind of tons of principles about fascia and how it works. I do go into a little bit about that, but not a ton. So yeah, that's coming up, and I would love to field some questions or chat.
Yeah.
I have a good question.
Mm-hmm.
On that, you have a question?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I always worry about the difference between restorative and yin.
Mm-hmm.
Because you hold the poses for a certain period of time. I teach restorative too, and I try to hold it for 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So can yin be held for, you said you can hold it for a long period of time also.
You can.
So how
mm-hmm.
do you differentiate one from the other one?
Well, yin can be practiced for a couple ways. Yin can be practiced without any props.
Okay, yeah.
Like special additions for most yin poses. Mm-hmm. Of course, restorative, it's like grab 6 blankets, 14 blocks, 8 blocks, 6 bolsters, 2 eye pillows.
They look like a mummy after a while.
Yeah, right? And so if you're, I haven't taken a restorative training, although I've taken lots of restorative classes over the years, but my understanding is if you're feeling stress on the joints or, the muscles, then you need more proppage in restorative. Okay. Whereas in yin, you should be feeling stress in somewhere in the body. Now, you could certainly use a prop to decrease that intensity, and that's really where props come into play, is helping people find that Goldilocks position we talked about. But you would want to be feeling something, whereas restorative, it's indicating that you need more blankets or whatever the prop is. So the other thing I like to say is yin, while it's again today used as a term to help people think that, oh, well, this is a relaxing class, yin can be very provocative. Having people hold pigeon pose for 5 minutes is generally not relaxing for most people. It's relaxing when they get to come out of it, hopefully. But the actual experience is one where there's a lot going on in the mind, and ideally you want to get people to be able to sit in the witness and realize, like, okay, I'm having sensations. My mind has a story about these sensations, but ultimately none of this is me. So I always use it as a tool to kind of like continue to point back to like what part of you is unchanging, what part of you is having this experience. So I don't always think of it as relaxing. It can be. It certainly can be a relaxing class depending on the kind of poses that you ultimately put together. But it can be a very stimulating class by the same respect. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I have a question about injury. Like if you, from a teaching perspective, if a student walks in and says, you know, I have a knee injury, or even something like, not injury specific, but just I'm curious about how you approach that from a yin perspective.
Well, I mean, I always approach any injury from just the broader yoga perspective of, have you been cleared to practice?
Like, maybe you should get that checked out.
Right.
I'm not a doctor.
Yeah. I mean, that's always the starting point for me, which is like, you know, if someone's like, I mean, the good thing is I have found that people who have had a knee surgery, a hip replacement, they are doing physical therapy for the most part. They do have an understanding of like, oh, well, you know what? Cow's face pose is no longer in my repertoire ever again. And so often injury for me is about just letting them know, hey, there might be poses in the sequence that are just out of bounds for you. Wave me over. We'll find another alternative, which is, you know, usually playing with gravity, flipping them on their back, or, you know, sometimes just like doing something completely different. If someone has a current injury, I don't have a lot of people that have current injuries coming into classes these days. I don't know. I have had people, I will say I have had people, and not like often, but people do come out of yin yoga and they're like, oh, that really, you know, I did something. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I mean, that can happen. It can happen. I got a massage a month ago and literally pulled my back because she had just opened it to the point of like, it was vulnerable. And that can certainly happen in a yoga class. It's not necessarily like the teacher or the sequence. It was like several things leading up to like the perfect storm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of injury, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you know, for me, injury is an interesting place to work. A lot of times, again, just speaking to our cultural pathology presenting itself in yoga class, the idea of working at 70 to 80% of your capacity is really hard for people. Yeah. They do not know how to not go to 100% and just like grin and bear it for 5 minutes. You know, Stacey Ramsauer, she brought her now husband, but he was fiance at a time, to the yin class. And we were doing supported bridge for 5 minutes. He refused to put the block underneath him. And like, you know, just like I could see it was shaking, clearly using muscles, even though I'm giving all the cues. It's about the fewest muscles possible you can use. And you know, he's like, no, I'm going to do bridge for 5 minutes. Like, okay. So it's honestly like giving people permission to work at a lesser level, strangely enough, offers that is an interesting experience in itself, but it also is a really interesting place to work. If you yourself have never just eased back in your practice, a lot of times at 80%, there's more sensation than 100% because you're used to 100%. So,
yeah, you know, it's interesting also asking students like this, getting the distinction between injury and an ache or a pain. Going like, I think it's in line with how you're talking about how the culture expresses itself through the practice.
Right.
It's like we wait till we're injured and then we do something.
You
know, it's like, okay, can we do something to be, the distinction we use in some of our training is prehab, rehab. Like we're always fluctuating between these two states. And it's like, I'm thinking of the bridge example, like go at 90, somewhere between 90 and 95 to 97%. And then, oh, there's an issue. Okay.
Right.
Now let's address this.
Yeah. So, I mean, in my trainings, my husband knows this, I use him as an example a lot. And I know, he knows, I come home and he's like, which stories did you tell about me today? I'm like, but he hurt his back earlier this year, maybe it was late last year. And he was at this point where he was like months and months and months. He's like, I'm waiting for it to feel better until I do yoga, do anything. And I was like, that's not how it works. And you know that, when we have an injury, like say you have an injury in your hamstring, you can't do everything around the hamstring and heal the hamstring. You have to address the hamstring, which will probably be uncomfortable. And there's, it's again, the yoga mat truly is your laboratory where certainly you don't want to injure yourself, but honestly, there will be times in your practice when you're like, oh, I've gone too far. Note that. How did I get there? What did I do? What was too far? Great. I'm not going to do that again. And there's times in your practice when you're like, I needed more. It's really kind of understanding now the range of motion in your body and your limitations and your flexibility and trying to detach from some of the, it's just sensation and your mind has a story about what this means. So trying to get kind of underneath even that and understand like what's real, what's really going on.
Yeah, that's great. I'm noticing that the way, from doing my own practice, my own yin yoga practice, which I need to get back to a class. I've done enough of it to go like, I have this, the way it occurs for me is that it's inherently safer. And I don't even know if that's accurate or why I have that to go like, I've always felt very supported and safe in it. Not to say, like you said, that it was like always the most pleasurable experience.
Yeah.
And I don't know, is that accurate? Is that like?
Well, it just depends. I mean, certainly you're moving slower and moving slower has or can have a more mindful quality to it than when you're moving faster. I mean, the poses are very grounded because again, you're working on the lower half of the body. So there's nothing like assuming a healthy body, there's nothing crazy about it. Like handstandy, like arm balancy, like things that I'd go, oh no, that's okay.
No horror stories of class. Oh my God, that happened.
Yeah. But that being said, it depends. Like Paul really is a perfect example of like kind of buff, kind of like built and had a really strong physical practice. His body was very strong. It wasn't super flexible or open. It didn't have a ton of range of motion. And so for him, yin is like, and really people who have a lot of tightness or range, kind of range of motion, limited range of motion, yin can be a great practice for that. It's the people, like if you were hyper flexible, I would be like, you probably wouldn't feel as safe in yin because you're right at that edge of like kind of gripping and like wanting to make sure things stay in together.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But, and it's all a balance. I have had people who are like, I only want to practice yin. And I'm like, no, that's not okay either. Because I get a lot of, which I feel really honored and it's great. I get a lot of power yogis that come into the yin practice and I see and honor, like they see a need for balance, which is great. And when you're imbalanced, what happens is you mostly want to continue to go the way of imbalance. So for example, people who are kind of drawn to yin, drawn to restorative, they're like, this is all I want to do. And it's like, actually a power vinyasa class would be great for you just to kind of get that, that tamasic energy, that kind of stagnant energy flowing. So there's so many variables, but I had somebody who did the teacher training several years ago who really just kind of like, and she fell in love with Yin, which is great. And she goes, I feel like I injured myself in Yin. And I said, well, tell me about your practice. Tell me what you're doing. And it turns out she was only doing Yin. Well, yeah, you gotta kind of be in balance. Like your body needs both. It needs the stability, it needs the strengthening, it needs the flexibility. You can't just throw out everything. So let's see. Would you say it's mostly a practice for runners? It's a great practice for runners for several reasons. One, runners tend to be really, as I know them, so this is a total gross generalization, but super type A, like, the runners are like, I run every day, I run 7 miles, they're very consistent, very dedicated practitioners of running. And that being said, so Yin and its softness is such a great counterpoint to that piece of their life, in terms of like cross training, but also, of course, because it focuses on the hips, the hamstrings, the lower back, the pelvis. It does target a lot of areas that runners generally tend to be tight in. But I'll tell you, runners are always like, I need to stretch, I need more flexibility. And Yin yoga is hard for them because they have to sit still for 3 to 5 minutes at a time for a whole damn hour. So it's great for them, and it's hard for them. It's really hard for them in a different way, because it's not just adding on a couple miles to their practice. It's literally like totally shifting the energetics of what they're used to.
There was a word that you used earlier that I'm not familiar with. You said the 3 primary principles are Tattvas.
Tattvas. Tattvas. If you've ever heard of the word sattva, of the gunas, spelled very similarly, just with a T instead of an S. So yeah, this basically means principle.
Thank you.
Oh, this is a great question. My take on the Vin Yin class. Well, this is where I get a bit traditional on it. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like I said a bit earlier, which I'm not sure if you were on the call or not, but I said Yin is a dish best served cold. So the issue with Vin Yin, and I get why it makes sense, because it makes sense like, well, let's work it out and then we'll end with something relaxing. Well, that's great, but that's where the term Yin is just used as a counterpoint to Yang. I don't know if Vin Yin teachers are really teaching it in a passive 3 to 5 minute cold scenario. So in order for you to really stress the tissues that Yin is targeting, again, that's bones, joints, ligaments, tendons, and fascia, you don't want the body warmed up as it would be if you had taken a vinyasa class prior to it. So I'm not a huge fan of Vin Yin, if only because it actually opens you up to injury. You don't want to, you want to understand, and we go into this more in the training, what are Yang principles of a practice? Well, that's where you emphasize alignment and drawing in and engaging the muscles and really protecting, frankly, the joints and the bones and the ligaments and the tendons. Now in Yin, because we're using a completely different pathology, then you're going to try to be passive, right? And softly stress, not stretch, these tissues. So my guess is in most Vin Yin classes, they're just using these kind of longer holds and not really the traditional pieces of Yin. If you were, it would certainly open you up to the possibility of injury. And same thing with heated yin. I can see in some cases, if you had a really inflexible, tight population, where applying some heat in these longer holds would make sense. It would kind of help them relax and open up. But for most people, 78 degrees is fine. You certainly don't need the humidity and the heat to help them with that. Did I answer your question? I think so. But let me know if there's any follow-up. So Sarah, by the way, teaches, the more traditional way to teach it is yin vin, i.e. you're starting cold. You do, now this is obviously in a workshop setting, but she would do 90 minutes to 2 hours of yin, followed by an hour of pretty intense vinyasa. That's pretty much the more how it's traditionally taught. Paul doesn't combine the two. He's primarily just doing yin in his classes. From a marketing standpoint, I understand you're indicating look, we're going to start with this kind of more powerful athletic practice and end with something relaxing. But I think that's just kind of a misunderstanding really or even a simplification and misunderstanding of what yin really is.
That's a really good point. The marketing piece of it, I think, can start what seems like in a good place, like it's for everybody, and meet the needs of everybody all at once. And that doesn't always make sense when you get into the actual practice, like the way the design, maybe that's a better description, is the design of the practice is designed a certain way. And I'm also thinking back to when you were talking about the early process of not creating a certain system, and that's a whole bigger conversation about systems, and then systems getting attached to marketing to be able to, I think it all starts from a good place, and it's honoring the design. There's something there.
Well, I think, I just having been a previous studio owner, I can understand, the thought our students might not be able to commit to an hour of yin, but if we packaged it 30-30, that might be a better intro to it. Or, I can see where they're getting there. And my concern is really goes back to the mixing of these two yang yin styles of stressing the tissues. They're not really meant to be mixed in that way. And it's not safe necessarily to mix them in that way. So, yeah.
Well, Rhia, I don't know if you mentioned this or not. I know you said it's a 20-hour training. I'm curious about the hours and about the dates.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have to look at my dates, but I want to say, my husband, and looking at my phone, he's like, I hope you locked the door. So just be prepared for a loud, rambunctious 5-year-old to bust in on us here. The hours are made for a mama who cannot be gone for 8 hours at a time, but I also feel like they work well. It's Friday evening from 7:15 to 9:15, and then Saturday and Sunday from 1 to 5. So that's one weekend. That's 10 hours in one weekend, and then you have the same schedule about a month later. Now, you didn't ask me this, but I'll answer. Why did I break it up? And that is because I really encourage students to go and practice teach the style in between our two meetings. It's so different than teaching a vinyasa or hatha class. There isn't as much space. I'm sure you probably teach this to your teacher trainees. It's how efficient can you be with your direction? You don't have to talk for their entire warrior one. You can let them have some space there. Well, it's even more space when you're teaching a yin class, because you've got 5 minutes, 3 minutes And that's an unusual practice even for teachers. So I have people, I really encourage people to go teach in between our 2 times. And that just makes the second session that much richer because people come back with more experience, and it kind of guides the direction of that second weekend in terms of what needs to be strengthened skill wise.
Yeah, got it. That's such a good point about the we describe it as being with the empty spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing you don't have to fill them.
Yeah.
So I had never considered that as, I'm always on the student side, but as Yin, it's like, you don't have to say anything. It's okay.
It's okay. Yeah, you're really, and people ask often like, well, what are you doing for that 5 minutes? I'm like, oh, I'm always on my iPhone.
Texting.
Yeah. I'm like, it's the same as being a meditation teacher. You're holding space as teacher for the student to do the work. And that means being present, being observant. It's not like you're not doing anything, but it is, I've noticed it's really uncomfortable for people to be quiet for several minutes at a time. So the dates of the training, by the way, September 28th, 29th, and 30th, and then October 26th, 27th, and 28th. And that's going to be at Sama Yoga, which used to be Texas Yogini, but she's in the transition phase of changing the name. I'm like, okay, that's not confusing at all, but no problem. Get through it.
I think I heard something about the building, like there's some building issues or something going on with that.
Yeah, so they're destroying that whole Chelsea market, which is fine. She's got a new space that's kind of by Memorial Park, but they're in permitting the hell that is permitting in Houston right now. So she was planning on having it being at the new space. I suspect at least the first weekend will probably be at the Montrose location, which is great. It's a sweet little.
Very cool. Cool. Well, I mean, I think that's time. Unless anyone has like questions yep.
I have a quick one. Do you foresee yourself perhaps doing a spring training as well?
I actually do have a training. It will be at B Yoga, tentatively scheduled for, I believe, March, April. And I don't have the exact dates on that, but yeah, so that is in the works.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I also, Rhia, I shared the emails of the participants with you. So, be in communication, whatever works.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if you guys have any other questions that come up, my email is just Rhia, like HEYRHIA @gmail.com. And I've had that email forever. And I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, because people are always like, oh, hey Rhia. I'm like, you say that all the time to me. So it became my email address.
Like when things just make sense.
Yeah, it's easy peasy. I'm like, I would like to think of a more creative name, but it's kind of cemented in there. Yeah, if any other questions come up, certainly reach out to me, or if that didn't all come through, ask Dan. He's got my information and I have yours. But thank you so much again for coming and listening and being curious about Yin. Oh, you're so welcome. And yeah, I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you for everybody. And thank you, Rhia, for taking the time. I don't know if everybody heard this at the beginning of the call, but it was just so easy. And I acknowledge everybody for, sharing a conversation, and hopefully there'll be more.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Y'all have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Rhia. Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome.